Today in world literature, we turn to the work of the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was born in 1938 and is widely recognized as the most important writer in contemporary East Africa. Weep Not, Child, published in 1964, was the first novel written in English to be published by an East African. A Grain of Wheat, a later novel, presented the African perspective of the armed revolt against the British during the 1950s. In his book of essays, Homecoming, Essays on African and Caribbean Literature, Culture, and Politics, published in 1972, Ngugi emphasized the important social function of literature. In this lecture, Dr. Kellerman focuses on an early story of Ngugi's, The Return.
Ngugi wa Thiong'o's short story, The Return, details through the eyes of an ex-political prisoner the unhappy transformation of his family, his village, and, in large, his nation of Kenya since his incarceration. This transformation is documented from the point of view of someone who has been newly released from his ordeal and has yet to have adjusted to a world outside prison, a world that has not stood still. Instead, the continuum of its events has flowed into the future much as the Honya River passes eternally through his village. The drama of the story hinges on the desertion of the protagonist's wife, through no fault of her own, but because of the scheming and lying of a fellow ex-prisoner who has carried the intentionally false news of the protagonist's death back from prison to his family. In despair, she eventually succumbs to his advances and becomes pregnant with his child. The story's aesthetics and emotional impact are grounded in the use of symbols. The dust on the road that brings the story's protagonist, Kamau, back at home at the beginning of this narrative can be understood as representing natural and civil rights, in contrast to the smoke it is described as, which represents both revolution and repression. Quote, "The road was long. Whenever he took a step forward, little clouds of dust rose, whirled angrily behind him, and then slowly settled again. But a thin train of dust was left in the air, moving like smoke. He walked on, however, unmindful of the dust and ground under his feet." While the story is intensely political in its import, its political message is embodied in a naturalism. The road leads to Kamau's small plot of land and family. The alignment of land and womanhood, to which this ex-prisoner is married although separated, becomes clear enough once he makes his way past some villagers and locates his father and mother who, only when being pressed for the truth, disclose his wife's abandonment. Eventually, after discovering the loss of his wife, he makes his way to the Honya River, and there he discovers the truth of his life and the premise for all his future actions. The river, by story's end, is also recognizable as a symbol. In fact, it is the story's imaginative center. The river exists in opposition to the dry dust of his past imprisonment, implied in the story's opening lines, and also to what Kamau will come to view as an illusion of happiness whose image was his wife. In contrast, the river signifies the moisture of replenishing rain, time, renewal, hope, and futurity. This is the river in which as a boy he would bathe. Then he was devoid of possessions. When swimming, he had no clothing. Now, in full adulthood, he has no land or wife. When he was a boy, he could commune with the essential self he will return to now as a man possessing only the wisdom that is bequeathed by fate to those who have been severely tested by harsh experience. Now, looking at that river, he recalls when he used to, quote, plunge naked, stark naked, into its cool living water. Now the river warmed his heart as he watched its serpentine movement." End quote. The flow of that river is the flow of history, both Kamau's and Kenya's. Ngugu's work falls within what can be called the protest tradition of literature, less like the general body of writing of West Africa and closer to the work of authors from South Africa. He is interested in, almost obsessed by, the struggle for freedom in Kenya and its destructive effects on the African way of life. His recent novel, Devil on the Cross, for instance, follows the life of a woman who has been uprooted by the sweep of political, economic, and social events that are a part of the protracted Kenyan upheaval in the wake of European post-colonialism. It is as if this character were a later literary invention that resulted from the circumstances in the short story The Return. Those circumstances surrounding the emigration of Mutoni, wife of Kamau, from his village. In the novel, at one point in her journey along the road to a place called Ilmorog, Waringa, the later version of Mutoni, recalls her struggles which arise from her betrayal by others. Unlike the story, however, the novel is surrealistic. In Ilmorog, Waringa will attend a feast of devils. She speaks of how she had once, quote, fought for this country's independence with her own hands, end quote. Yet, as another of this book's characters says to her with a bitter wisdom, "These days, the land rewards not those who clear it for development, but those who come after it has been cleared." Independence, in other words, independence from colonial oppression and exploitation, independence is not tales about the past, but the sound of money in one's pocket. This is the future that must be faced by both Kamau and Mutoni in the short story The Return. The Mau Mau uprising, whose memory forms the backdrop for this tale, was both materially and spiritually costly. The later novel, Devil on the Cross, in keeping with the earlier story, speaks of how some Kenyans found themselves betraying their own best interests. One such person is Moora, who is a reprise of Karanja, the fellow ex-prisoner who had lied about Kamau's death in order to seduce and subsequently impregnate Mutoni. As Ngugu's narrator says in the novel, Moora used to get 5 shillings for the head of every Mau Mau follower he killed. Moora would scout the villages at night. Old women, children, young men, young girls, old men. Moora did not mind. After all, the Mau Mau didn't wear identity badges. In the morning, Moora would take the heads to Ngui, who would give him bounty for murder. The terrorism of the Mau Mau and the counter-terrorism of what was known as the emergency period in Kenya exacted a total involvement, even from the irresolute. There was a period of senseless disciplinary killing of blacks who were out after the sunset curfew or without identity papers, which was officially sanctioned eradication, in other words, as well as the unofficially murderous subterfuge that it really was. As in the short story The Return, venomous betrayal and defeat are finally only temporary. The righteous persevere and eventually triumph. Mutoni's counterpart, Waringa, quote, strides along with energy and purpose, her dark eyes radiating the light of an inner courage, the courage and light of someone with firm aims in life. Yes, the firmness and the courage and the faith of someone who has achieved something through self-reliance. What's the use of shuffling along timidly in one's own country? Ngugu's first novel, entitled Weep Not Child, also describes the breakup of a traditional African family because of a turbulent political situation, a situation that is part of the prolonged Kenyan struggle for independence. Diaspora, in other words, is a prevailing theme throughout his works, serving as a dramatic fulcrum for examining the ill effects of colonialism and its aftermath. Returning from a stint on a work gang building roads, the protagonist in this first novel, named Boro, speaks of how tired he and his fellow laborers were. Yet he remembers, quote, "We came home worn out, but very ready for whatever the British might give us as a reward. But more than this, we wanted to go back to the soil and courted to yield, to create, not to destroy. But Ngui, the land was gone. My father and many others had been moved from our ancestral lands. He died lonely, a poor man waiting for the white man to go." The road is an important symbol in both Devil on the Cross and Weep Not Child. It is a path through ordeal. It is a road that takes its people toward an ultimate triumph. These books are hopeful in the end. So is the story The Return, according to the same pattern of dramatic development. But now, as I have suggested already, this story's abiding symbol is not a road, but a river. What is remarkable when taking the sum total of Ngugi's writings into account is that this symbol is first used in another early novel entitled The River Between, and that this novel offers no basis for maintaining an optimistic view of life. As if to signal this translation of meaning from one to the other, the first noun the reader encounters in the short story, or perhaps in the original Kenyan language of Kikuyu, it is the very first word. That first word is the word road, and it is this road that will lead the protagonist to the river, where he will experience an epiphany about his life and thereby enjoy some solace for his loss. In The River Between, the clash between the colonial order and the traditional way of life is presented through the play of color contrasts, contradictory emotions and allegiances, antagonistic oppositions of phenomena, and conflict situations within a single character, between characters, and between representatives of opposing ideological approaches to life. In that book, the hills, standing in opposition to one another, meet at the banks of the river that both unites and divides them, but that flows on, a symbol of life and cure. Ngugi charges all phenomena with symbolic content. Moreover, he endows landscape with a historicity, and so we come to view the Honya River within a qualitative time. Thus, in the novel The River Between, we find the following description of that river. Quote, "A river flowed through the valley of life. If there had been no bush and no forest trees covering the slopes, you could have seen the river when you stood on top of either Kamenu or Makuyu. The river was called Honya, which meant cure or bring back to life. Honya River never dried. It seemed to possess a strong will to live. And it went on in the same way, never hurrying, never hesitating. People saw this and were happy." Late in the book, as the dramas of its characters unfold to their natural ends, the book's narrator observes that, quote, "the Honya River went on flowing through the valley of life, throbbing, murmuring an unknown song," end quote. The song may not be identifiable, but what is clear is that the lives of the people in this book are bracketed and in some profound sense are defined by the river specifically and generally by a ritualized geography. In the short story The Return, Kamau's final understanding of his life comes to him only when he is standing by that same body of water, as is evident in this passage. "Standing at the bank, he saw not the river, but his hopes dashed on the ground instead. The river moved swiftly, making ceaseless monotonous murmurs. In the forest, the crickets and other insects kept up an incessant buzz. And above, the moon shone bright. He tried to remove his coat, and the small bundle he had held on to so firmly fell. It rolled down the bank, and before Kamau knew what was happening, it was floating swiftly down the river. For a time he was shocked and wanted to retrieve it. What would he show his... Oh, had he forgotten so soon? His wife had gone, and the little things that had so strangely reminded him of her and that he had guarded all those years had gone. He did not know why, but somehow he felt relieved. Thoughts of drowning himself dispersed. He began to put on his coat, murmuring to himself, "Why should she have waited for me? Why should all the changes have waited for my return?" Here, Kamau's bundle, brought from prison, which represents to him a life in the past, a life to be relinquished both emotionally and intellectually, accidentally falls into the river, and so his destiny is aligned with the inevitability and indeed the moral force of nature. In this way, too, the overall nationalist struggle of his country, Kenya, may be understood as being inherently justified. Yet again, no matter how naturalist this story is, for Ngugu it is sharply political. Moreover, in his collection of essays entitled Homecoming, and let's note the similarity to the title of the similarity of this collection to the title of the short story. In this collection, Ngugu envisions an unbroken interrelatedness of the cultural side of humanity and the social reality surrounding human beings, in which politics and economics feature prominently. And he believes that the story of Kenya has been deliberately distorted by European writers. This idea underlies the conscious historical perspective of his work. So does his belief that the past is important as a base for pondering the present and the future. In the novel Homecoming, in the collection Homecoming, Ngugu writes, "For what has been is intimately bound up with what might be. Our vision of the future, of diverse possibilities of life and human potential, has roots in our experience of the past. It is out of this past that the black race, he feels, must seek the inspiration to build a new society. Yet this past contains great calamity and sorrow. Historically, land, as the source of man's life, as the basis of any social community and the foundation of all human culture, has remained the sensitive factor in the contention between Africans and Europeans in Kenya. Consider this early century comment by W. McGregor Ross, a senior British civil servant in Kenya at that time. Quote, "It may be restated that up to the year 1926, no native tribe in the country, that is Kenya, was given any legal or definitive right to any land. In the years 1919 to 21, the subjugation of the natives of East Africa was probably more complete than it ever will be again." End quote. Now, needless to say, all of this land was once theirs. In the book Facing Mount Kenya, the great nationalist leader Jomo Kenyatta wrote pointedly that, quote, "A culture has no meaning apart from social organization of life on which it is built. When the European comes to the Kikuyu country and robs the people of their land, he is taking away not only their livelihood, but the material symbol that holds family and tribe together." End quote. It was primarily over the land that the Mau Mau War was fought, notes the critic Ikede in discussing Ngugu. In Homecoming, Ngugu explains how, in his fiction, he is not simply recording and fictionalizing, but recreating and reinterpreting history, building his experience, his imaginative presentation of reality, into a vision that seeks to probe what any political and economic arrangement does to the spirit governing human relationships. For him, this is what literature is about.
In his essays, Ngugu has put forth the argument that decolonization must involve a very radical movement away from European values and systems, including the very language which carries these values. His novel, Devil on the Cross, published in 1980, written while he was in prison for the production of one of his plays, was composed in his native language. Ngui argues for a decolonization of the mind, the central task for the contemporary generation of African writers. His position, as Bill Ashcroft and his colleagues summarize it in a book entitled The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures, is a powerful reminder of the unsolved problems for the African writer in English who desires to speak to and for the people and not just to an educated elite and a foreign readership.